Okay, so somebody has so far.
So I'm having a party in February.
It's gonna have too much fun.
Stay safe.
Good morning. And so now we have time for our questions and answers and dialogue, and all questions are encouraged, especially from people who are new or identify as new. And especially if you're thinking, no, I shouldn't ask that, that's obvious, everybody knows that. Yes.
I'm new. Or shouldn't we always try to approach it that way? So the other day when I was practicing and doing some, this really is a basic question, and so as part of the prayers that are in our standard practice, we recite some aspirations that are known as the four immeasurables. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be apart from the sacred happiness, which is free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, impartial, free of attachment and aversion. Lama Michael always talks about the equanimity. So it just occurred to me, and we always talk about suffering and the causes of suffering, and that's all clear. But may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. What are we talking about with the causes of happiness as distinguishable from the causes of suffering?
That's the question.
Yeah.
You ask him what he thinks.
The causes of happiness versus the causes of suffering.
With happiness, you have equanimity. With suffering, you don't have equanimity.
I was sort of going through the intellectual answer, right? And I was thinking, well, pretty. There are some things where I'm pretty confident you could say, all right, for just about everybody, this would be a cause of suffering. But then you have the teaching from 7-point mind training, sort of 3 poisons, 3 objects, 3 poisons, 3 seeds of virtue. And the 3 objects are talking about the causes of what we think are the causes of happiness, which are in fact the causes of suffering. And our relation to them, which is of attachment or aversion or ignorance. But even those 3 poisons then turn out to be the causes of the seeds of virtue, and the potential causes of happiness. So, but the other, I guess, my other response is the way that I've always related to the immeasurables, especially wishing the causes of happiness, wishing happiness and the causes of happiness for others. My experience or practice of it is one of kindness. And so I guess the felt experience is one of yearning for benefit for others. And kind of this craving to uncover or support or encourage benefit in any interaction at any time. And the tricky thing is sometimes it's obvious, like what's going to be beneficial to someone, and then sometimes it's not so clear. But the practice is to hold open the wish and bring your attention into the moment and look and see, look and listen. Listening is a big piece of it. In fact, if I have a practice around the four immeasurables, I would say that's what it is. It's a practice of listening. And I'm listening for happiness and the causes of happiness. I'm listening for suffering and the causes of suffering. And if my attention and my aspiration and my intention align, and sometimes the magic happens. But I guess the other part of the experience is it's hard to claim then that benefit is something that you do. It seems like it's something that happens, like a gift from the universe. So that may not have been your quite the answer you were looking for, but that's my experience of those lines in the four immeasurables. Would love to hear your thoughts or reflections on them as well.
Well, you reflected back to me. I mean, I recited the prayer, and we often talk of those four immeasurables as what that means is loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So, what you reflected back is the loving kindness aspect of it, which is what I focused my question on. So it does seem to me that, and you talk more about how you practice it in each moment, which is very nice to hear. But I take that to mean is that, the source of true happiness is 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 trying to is focusing on the happiness of others rather than the happiness of self. But it's almost like just sort of the flip side of the suffering, which is, we all know that we suffer because of, ignorance as to the nature of the way things really are, and self-clinging, and our ego focus, which is the opposite of trying to focus on the happiness of others. So, anyway, it's clear to me that I still harbor a great deal of confusion when it comes to putting it all into practice.
Yeah, you and me both. But thank you for making explicit some of the things I was struggling to put into words.
Thanks.
Yes.
Taking that thought, can you just, so loving kindness sounds great. Can you talk about how to hold that with anxiety? The idea that we should strive for loving kindness, but if anxiety is something we're stuck in, or worry or anxiety. And on some level, being worried and anxious is a bit of an ego claim, but it's still there and gets in the way of moving forward with a really kind approach.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. We were just talking about holding kindness for others rather than focusing on one's own benefit. But in the sort of the Buddhist worldview doesn't hold yourself as something that actually exists separate from others. So I've heard, my favorite teacher on the subject is Thich Nhat Hanh, and he says you need to hold that anxiety the way you hold a little baby. And you need to take care of your anxiety and that part of yourself just like you take care of your baby. And I think that in that moment, when that's your experience, that's what loving kindness looks like. Yes, Michael.
So this has come up for me recently, and again, my experience of it is somewhat out of refuge recovery and a Theravada tradition, where loving kindness phrases are offered first to yourself, and then to it expands out to all beings, and you can also just do the four measurables that way.
Yes.
And I also have been taught with Tonglen that you start with yourself.
Yes.
And recently, when I was at a conference in LA for refuge recovery, Dr. Steve Danziger, who is the clinical director of their inpatient, outpatient treatment down there, was talking about trauma-informed mindfulness practice. And one of the things that he said with the loving kindness stuff was you start with yourself, and then you begin to expand it out to, a benefactor, and then to, all sentient beings, and of course the most difficult person in your life, you try to do that as well. And then come back to yourself at the end as well. And I have found doing metta practice for myself to be very helpful with that. And also in a lot of the new brain science stuff, And also, who's the guy that wrote Buddha's Brain?
Rick Hansen.
Rick Hansen. He kind of basically says, and also Noah Levine, who's the author of Refuge Recovery, says is that what we're doing when we're doing those phrases over and over again are creating new neural pathways. And so that actually has a lot, can really help with the development of self-love, as well as, just allowing the genuine loving kindness that you already have in your Buddha nature, flower more, so.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we're finding all kinds of interesting sort of scientific ways of supporting what we, I think, can also experience through practice, which is whatever you practice grows stronger. And it's no surprise at all that there would be a neurological element of that. And it's nice to think that that the neuroanatomists and physiologists are also concluding that our self is not as solid or fixed as we may have taken it to be. Yes?
In response to Alan's question, you said that the three poisons can become, I believe, the seeds of virtue.
Yeah.
I probably said that not quite exactly as you did.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if you could say more about that.
Oh,
to
sure.
Understand that a little bit better.
Yes. Well, it's really, that's the, it's sort of the beautiful ridiculousness of Buddhism. That, well, the ordinary way of thinking is that suffering is something to be avoided. Like that's sort of the Buddhist psychology boils down to we tend to do things because we think they're going to be beneficial for us, and we tend to avoid things or move away from things that we think are going to be harmful. And so we know we don't like suffering, and so we work to avoid it. And but the Buddha taught almost the opposite approach. Instead of working so hard to not suffer, the Buddha taught that it's possible to use suffering on the path, and then suffering becomes the universe's way of teaching you what's beneficial and what is not. So instead of trying to get rid of attachment, for example, and this lines up nicely with what Michael was talking about in terms of addiction recovery. Like the standard approach would be, well, if you're addicted to something, don't do that. And avoid that. and that's not to say that's not a beneficial, that there's no benefit in that approach. Clearly, there's a lot of benefit in that approach. And most people will try that approach first. But the reason that 12-step programs are so powerful is that people try that approach on their own, and then they find themselves, gee, I'm doing it again. Here I am back again. So there's a recognition that something greater is needed. And one of those elements is community, and one is spirituality. So what the Buddha taught was that it may be important to avoid that poison, but it's also important to look more deeply into what is the nature of the poison and what is our relationship to it. And in that looking, there's tremendous opportunity to, at not just an intellectual level, but a very deep experiential level, to learn who we are. You know, I always, earlier in my medical career, I was kind of jealous of the addicts, because they had great clarity about what was the problem, and they had sort of a really kind of lovely support community to help them address it, and those were my favorite people, because I get to talk to a lot of people. Like, the people that are most fun to talk to are the people who've really been working a 12-step program, or really, I mean, they're just wonderful people to talk to. So, yeah, I'll probably stop there. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I don't know if this is a question, but just the last comment you made, I sort of thought, through the process of paying more attention to what goes on in my mind stream, if somebody from the outside looked at me and knew my behaviors, they would say, oh no, she's not an addict. But in my mind stream, I feel addictions. Whether it's to food or to relationships, or there are huge addictions there, and it's incredibly painful to watch that urge, that desire. But it's also my ability to watch that keeps it from becoming an actual physical addiction. Like, especially with food. I have to eat food, and I feel that urge to eat more, and it's painful, but it's that scene of the painfulness of it, and just feeling that deep sense of compassion for, wow, everybody else must be feeling the same craving. That's what keeps it from turning into, I'll eat that whole cake. But don't you think we're all addicted in that sense?
I completely agree. That's my experience too. I think the advantage that addicts have is they know what they're addicted to.
Mhm.
The rest of us may not be quite so clear about it. But I think you also illustrated a really nice example of how if the path were merely bringing more attention to suffering, it wouldn't be much of a path. Like most, because one of the things you learn is don't do that. Unless you have a practice to go with it, which I think you illustrated very nicely, which is sort of bringing compassion into the equation. And so for you, the object, food, and then the poison, which is craving, turns into the antidote, which is compassion. So thank you. My teacher says that the reason suffering exists is to wake us up.
I have just a little question. Like when they do the four measurables, when there's like a book of like prayers, I think that Alan was talking about. Do you have your hands together like you're praying, or is that one of the ones where you don't have your hands together? And what differentiates having your hands together versus not?
I've always done that one with my hands together.
You have, okay.
And my general rule for trying to figure that out in the text is functionally the prayer mudra is a way of bringing a physical aspect to the act of devotion and aspiration. And it's my way of figuring out if I'm supposed to have my hands in the prayer mudra or not. Well, sometimes I'll ask, and the best resources for that I've discovered is Lamatara. If you get to, Lamatara seems to have been very specific over her whole practice life in determining whether what is the correct. Yes. So, but if I'm not sure, then I err on the side of having prayer mudra. But I've noticed that a lot of the visualizations, when they're describing the visualization, like in the Chinrezi prayer, the Chinrezi practice, the parts where we don't have our hands together is when they're describing what we should be visualizing. Mm-hmm. And then most of the others, our hands are together in the attitude of prayer.
Thank you.
Yes, Peter.
So if you don't do the hands right, you're going to go to hell?
Somebody's been reading Words of My Perfect Teacher.
And which hell?
Well, in Words of My Perfect Teacher, I think it says, in your next life, you're reborn without hands. So that's the. But just to be clear, I think there's no need to take on the Tibetans or Easterners' cultural baggage. We have enough of our own. And I believe if you're wondering if it's beneficial or not, fair to try it both ways and see if you can tell the difference. Yes?
So as someone who's entirely new and
Wonderful. Yay.
beyond practicing meditation
Yes.
and studying and reading
Yes.
and learning, is there anything else that you would suggest, or is there anything perhaps, if you could speak to yourself when you were new, that you would say?
Yes. That's a great question. Thank you. Well, the thing that really got me hooked was going on retreats, and my first retreat was such an extraordinary experience. I sort of carried the afterglow of it with me for several months afterwards, and I think it's, when you're starting, it's difficult to build up enough momentum in your even if you're able to do a daily sitting practice, it can be difficult to build up enough momentum and actually experience the benefits of that. It's much easier to do in a retreat. So even if it's just a couple of days, I shouldn't say just a couple of days, even if it's a couple of days, I think that's powerful. I think the other thing that really sort of sealed the deal for me was meeting Kyabje Bokar Rinpoche, so meeting a really accomplished master. I mean, I really only met him one time in my entire life. But I was just telling someone earlier today, I've never met anybody like that before or since. And even though I was just brand new to the Dharma and to practicing, he was so different from anybody that I'd ever encountered before, that even though I didn't really know what I was seeing, I knew that like, wow, that's different. That I didn't realize people could be like that. And so that think, going to see, so Ringo Tolku is coming in November, going to see the teachers, not with the expectation that there'll be anything. I remember the first time I went to see His Holiness Dalai Lama, I just kind of came away kind of like, oh, rats, I thought this was going to be, I thought it was going to be something, and then it was something entirely different. But going with an attitude of curiosity to see people or to meet people who spend a lot of time in practice, I think is really valuable. I've always found coming here to be beneficial personally. I mean, there have been times in my life where I couldn't really practice on a daily basis. But if I could come here, I could practice when I was here with the support of the community. And like when my daughter was born and we had a baby, my attention was needed. But my wife was kind, she let me come here, and that was enough. It's probably enough for starters. Yeah. Yes, Michael.
So, Eric, I'd be interested in just a brief synopsis maybe of what you guys are going to be doing for the Death and Dying retreat.
Sure.
Or series.
Yes. Well, I can tell you what we did last time, and I'm meeting with Chosen and David McWhorter and Mary Woods next week, and we're going to talk. We're going to try and figure out, are we just going to do what we did last time, or will it be different? But so for those of you who don't know, Chosen Bays is an extraordinary Zen teacher who's one of the founders of the Zen community of Oregon. And she's also a pediatrician who worked on the child abuse response and evaluation service, which was a service for all the hospitals that was called to the emergency room when for suspected child abuse cases. So she had this sort of extraordinary medical practice of showing up in emergency rooms to talk to parents who were being accused of abusing their kids. And but Chosen is actually like a major figure in North American Buddhism also. She has an international reputation. So she's been teaching a class on death and dying for a long time, and she teaches it every 2 years. And so about 2 years ago, we were interested in doing something as well. And somebody suggested, well, maybe you should try to make your two things interrelate. And we all thought that was kind of a cool opportunity. And so we did. The first time, basically Chosen did her 4 classes, and then we did our 4. And she she has a lot of interesting ways to approach the practice. She has people watch movies that have to do with death and dying. She has people write their own obituary. She has a number of sort of guided visualization and meditation exercises that you visualize yourself as a dying person and also as the person taking care of that person. So she has you do it sort of together, which creates a level of intimacy with somebody you maybe don't know very well that's kind of extraordinary. And she also talks about near-death experience, or the experience of the afterlife. And my approach was much more sort of functional, and I wasn't, at the time I did this, I wasn't a teacher here. So I sort of taught from my own base of familiarity, which was I'm a palliative care physician and talking about advanced care planning. And we had an estate planning attorney come and talk to people about what they need to know about estate planning, and both for themselves and also thinking about their parents. We had people actually do the conversation starter kit and then complete an advance directive, and then their job was to go and talk to one of their family members about what they wanted. So we used those very practical means as a lever to make the contemplation of death and impermanence very tangible for people and sort of practical. And David McWhirter, who's a Sangha member who left, I think, is also an amazing family therapist, and he did a role play with us where we tried to create the most dysfunctional family we could. Boy, you should see that. I did not know this level of skill existed. There was nothing that they could throw at David which even remotely perturbed him, which he couldn't turn into a positive thing. That was really pretty amazing. And then Mary Woods did a session on hands-on caregiving. So I think those are the main things. Thanks for asking. Thank you for your questions and your attention. Let's dedicate the merit.
By this virtue may I quickly realize beyond measure and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
So let's do diligence.
Gina had weeks. I'll be back on the 29th. Oh, the Medicaid. Oh, what did they deny some benefits in the appeal?
Basically double charged.
How are you?
Well, yeah, that's a little. Well, I would like.
I don't think so.
Okay, well, at least it's not a great deal of money. The principle is the principle.
Like, actually, like, try to lose 10 pounds, where you're like, I know I'm just gonna charge this anyway. It's interesting.
Because it's all institution over coding.
She thinks it's
Right. Thank you.
That I realized last week I had this kind of, you know, I had those, which are just real primal.
And they have a whole.
You want your stuff?
My orientation is productivity. My family origins ago.
Wow, well, that's good. You shouldn't, she had to go.
First grade, so to not be sure if I'm
To know, I mean, you would never know.
doing enough to do that well. And then the actual fear of having something that isn't right versus one.
So is she still doing,
good thing feels key stuff.
You're also putting yourself out there to judge
I
too.
have the automatic.
You know, what's funny is I started dating at the same time.
Oh, wow.
So
She missed.
Thought I would, you know, go all or nothing.
Yeah, right?
So I'm really distracted to boot.
She does.
I meet with a coach once a month and talk about stuff. And it's interesting because he's very positive. And he's science-based. His company is called Happy Brain Science. He came from being a game developer in Intel.
Sure.
And now he runs this company.
Well, basically, a credit card
So I loved when he backed up with science on
information goes out of
optimism or science and gratitude, or science on,
Right.
you know, instead of a status report, doing
So
a,
I
like,
have to give
a
her
different type of
Oh,
approach, or starting a meeting with
Okay.
gratitude, what your brain looks like
You
with
know,
gratitude. So his work is really interesting.
Other kids who are
So even though I hear myself saying all this, it's like,
Oh, God.
wondering what I can do next week to feel
when I resigned.
like I'm doing it.
Old age,
And that
sickness.